Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you.
Harmony Glades. A facade of perfection. Heat radiated from Harmony Glades, scorching the emerald lawns to brittle uniformity. Sprinklers ticked and whirred, their monotonous drone eclipsing the synthetic chirps of bioengineered robins, programmed for approved avian arias. Each residence, a pastel echo of its neighbor, stood regimented, flower beds teeming with carbon copy petunias. Harmony Glades, a name that tasted of ash. Brenda Kensington surveyed her manicured fiefdom. A strained smile stretched across her features, her lilac stucco gleamed, roses suffered her zealous pruning shears, and a newly acquired ceramic Dalmatian, courtesy of the approved garden accoutrements, guarded the immaculate path, yet the smile failed to ignite her gaze. The sheer effort of maintaining this facade was slowly suffocating her. She adjusted her designer shades, a futile attempt to conceal the encroaching weariness bracketing her eyes, the sunglasses, like her carefully constructed persona. The breezy linen dress, the understated pearl studs, the supple leather flats, were calculated to project an image of effortless prosperity. An image increasingly difficult to project. Brenda, darling, everything looks exquisite, as always. Trish Abernathy's voice, coated in saccharine sweetness and thinly veiled covetousness, sliced through the air. Trish, enhanced by a surgeon's steady hand and married to a man who actually earned a living, unlike Brenda's perpetually between gigs. Leonard served as Brenda's relentless benchmark. Trish, what a pleasant surprise, Brenda replied, her tone mirroring Trish's artificiality. Just a touch of weeding. Leonard insisted I get some air. She indicated a single, defiant dandelion plucked from the immaculate expanse, displaying it like a trophy. Trish's gaze sharpened momentarily, but she quickly recovered. Well, you certainly have a gift. The HOA will be ecstatic. Speaking of which, have you reviewed the proposed budget for the fountain revamp? Utterly outrageous. I refuse to let that eyesore diminish our property values. Brenda's grip tightened on the weed. The fountain. Another levy. Another drain on her dwindling coffers. The HOA, with its relentless bylaws and army of pearl-clutching arbiters, was bleeding her dry. Oh, I haven't had the chance yet, Brenda demurred, striving for nonchalance. Leonard's been keeping me incredibly busy. He's involved in a marvelous new endeavor. Highly lucrative, I assure you. She cringed inwardly. The endeavor was Leonard's latest quest for YouTube stardom, reviewing forgotten board games. Thus far, his earnings barely covered the cost of the lighting equipment. Trish arched a perfectly sculpted brow. How stimulating, she drawled, the word dripping with disbelief. Well, I must dash that I have a luncheon with the Horticultural Society. We're debating the optimal arrangement of begonias for enhanced curb appeal. She bestowed a brittle smile and drifted away, her designer handbag a glinting weapon. Brenda watched her depart, the dandelion reduced to fragments in her fist. Curb appeal, fiscal worth, begonias, the only currency in this stifling world of manufactured perfection. Inside, air conditioning buzzed, offering a temporary sanctuary from the oppressive heat. Brenda kicked off her flats, the fine leather chafing her weary feet. She entered her sterile kitchen, every surface mirroring her reflection, every appliance gleaming. A symbol of her devotion. A monument to her mounting debts. She poured a glass of Chardonnay, the bottom shelf variety purchased by the case. It tasted of vinegar, but it provided oblivion, and that was enough. She gazed out at the flawless green, the cookie-cutter houses, the robotic sprinklers tirelessly irrigating the artificial Eden. A wave of resentment crashed over her. They didn't appreciate her. None of them. They saw the flawless lawn, the designer attire, the practiced smile, but remained blind to her sacrifices. They didn't see the sleepless nights spent wrestling with finances, the hidden credit card statements, the snowballing debt threatening to consume her. They were all so undeserving. They thrived on her diligence, her relentless efforts to uphold the facade of Harmony Glades, never grasping the true cost. They nitpicked her fountain selections and garden ornaments, oblivious to the fact that she was the one propping up this whole charade. And she was done with the duplicity, done with the charade, done with the relentless pressure to maintain the illusion. Something had to shatter, and soon a dangerous spark ignited in her eyes. She swirled the cheap wine in her glass, a strategy slowly solidifying in her mind, a scheme that would finally grant her the authority she craved, the financial independence she deserved, a scheme that would ensure they all paid dearly. The loopholes beckon. Brenda stared at the blinking cursor on her laptop screen, the electric hum a mocking soundtrack to her mounting despair. The Harmony Glades HOA dues were due tomorrow, and after juggling bills like a desperate clown, she was still short. The late fees were predatory, compounding her already precarious situation. She massaged her temples, the scent of lavender lotion, another carefully curated detail of her perfect facade, failing to soothe her. She'd been up for hours, ostensibly reviewing the HOA finances. It was a thankless task she'd volunteered for, hoping to curry favor with Mrs. Hathaway, the HOA president, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes. Brenda scrolled through the online banking portal, a labyrinthine system cobbled together from outdated software and wishful thinking. It was tedious, but she needed to look busy to justify the exorbitant cost of her home office. Suddenly, a discrepancy. A duplicated transaction. Brenda blinked, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on her. She clicked on it, then clicked again, navigating through layers of clunky menus. There it was. A payment to Green Thumb Landscaping listed twice with sequential transaction IDs, but different routing numbers. One legitimate, one not. Her heart pounded. Green Thumb Landscaping was the HOA's lawn care service. Brenda knew Mr. Henderson, the owner, well enough to know he wasn't tech-savvy enough to pull off something like this. Someone had manually entered a second transaction, diverting funds, but where? She spent the next hour tracing the rogue routing number. It led to an offshore account, a digital black hole nestled somewhere in the Cayman Islands. A wave of dizziness washed over her. This wasn't a simple error. This was fraud, fear warred with a different emotion, a tingling sensation that started in her stomach and spread through her limbs. An opportunity. A lifeline. She imagined transferring a small sum, just enough to cover the HOA dues, and no one would notice, not in the chaotic mess of transactions. She could replace it later, when her investments finally paid off. It was just a temporary loan, a digital borrowing from Peter to pay Brenda. The thought, once planted, took root with alarming speed. The loopholes beckoned, shimmering with promise in the cold light of the laptop screen. The system was vulnerable. She knew how to navigate it. The risks were manageable. A loud bang startled her. It came from outside, from the street. She peeked through the blinds. A moving truck, gleaming white and ridiculously oversized, was lumbering to a halt across the street. New neighbors, just what she needed. Brenda forced a smile and smoothed her silk robe. Image was everything. She grabbed her Welcome to Harmony Glades basket, filled with artisanal jams and locally sourced honey. All purchased on credit, of course. As she crossed the street, a tall man with kind eyes and a disarming smile emerged from the truck. He extended a hand. "Mark Miller," he said, his grip firm and warm. "Just moved in." "Brenda Kensington," she replied, offering the basket. "Welcome to Harmony Glades. We're so happy to have you." Mark chuckled, accepting the basket. "Happy to be here. Seems like a nice, quiet place." He paused, looking around at the manicured lawns and cookie-cutter houses. "Though I must say, the HOA seems intense." Brenda's smile tightened. "Oh, we like things just so," she said, a little too brightly. "Keeps property values up, you know." Mark's gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, a glint in his eye she couldn't quite decipher. "Of course," he said, "property values." He looked back at the truck, where movers were unloading boxes. "Well, I should get back to it. Unpacking is a beast. Let me know if you need anything," Brenda offered, the words feeling hollow, even to her own ears. As she turned to leave, Mark called out, "Hey Brenda, what kind of work do you do?" "I'm in finance," she said too quickly. "Really?" Mark said, a strange look on his face. "What a coincidence. So am I." Small transfers, growing doubts. Brenda Kensington stared at the computer screen, the cursor blinking mockingly above the transfer amount. Field $500. It seemed so insignificant. A mere rounding error in Kensington Estate's monthly budget. Just a tiny sliver, skimmed off the top. She typed it in, her fingers trembling slightly. 500.00. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of her home office. The air conditioning hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the chaos brewing inside her. She closed her eyes, picturing the mountain of bills stacked on her kitchen counter, the overdue notice from the children's school, the looming credit card statements, the whispered threat from her husband, Mark, about tightening their belts, just a little bit, to tide them over. She could put it back later. Nobody would ever know. With a sharp exhale, she clicked the transfer button. A confirmation message flashed. Transaction successful. Relief washed over her, quickly followed by a wave of icy guilt. She slammed the laptop shut, as if severing the connection to her transgression. The taste in her mouth was metallic, bitter. She told herself it was the stale coffee. The next few weeks passed in a blur of tightly controlled anxiety and fleeting moments of almost giddy freedom. 500 became 800, then 1,000. Small transfers, each one meticulously planned and executed, siphoned into the anonymous offshore account. She'd painstakingly set up that a new silk scarf, the color of a Tuscan sunset, appeared draped casually over a chair in the living room. Restaurant meals, usually reserved for special occasions, became more frequent. Brenda found herself drawn to the boutiques she usually bypassed, purchasing small, exquisite luxuries, artisanal soaps, hand-stitched leather journals, a delicate silver bracelet. Each acquisition felt like a tiny victory, a tangible reward for her cleverness. These weren't things she needed, they were things she deserved. Mark noticed the subtle shifts. The new scarf, for instance, he hadn't said anything, but his eyebrows had arched slightly, a silent question hanging in the air. He'd also noticed the increasingly frequent phone calls, always conducted in hushed tones, always ending abruptly when he entered the room. "Everything all right, Brenda?" he asked one evening, finding her pacing in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear. She jumped, startled. "Fine, fine," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. "Just dealing with a contractor. About the landscaping." Mark frowned. They hadn't discussed landscaping. He knew she was stressed. He'd seen the way she flinched at the sound of the doorbell, the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. He attributed it to the pressure of managing the HOA and balancing her volunteer work. But something felt different now, a new layer of tension, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, he came home early to find Brenda frantically deleting something on her computer. She slammed the laptop shut the moment he walked in, her face flushed. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "Just clearing out old files," she stammered, avoiding his gaze. "You know, decluttering." He didn't believe her. The lie hung heavy in the air between them, thicker than the aroma of the lavender potpourri on the windowsill. He wanted to press her, to demand answers, but the fear of what he might find stopped him. He backed down, mumbling something about being tired, and retreated to the den. Later that night, after Brenda had fallen asleep, Mark quietly slipped into the home office. He sat down at her computer, his hands trembling that he knew he shouldn't be doing this, that he was violating her privacy, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He opened her browser history. The usual websites were there: Kensington Estates HOA, volunteer organization pages, online shopping sites. Then, buried beneath the surface, a string of unfamiliar URLs caught his eye. Offshore banking regulations, anonymous wire transfers, deleting browser history permanently. His blood ran cold. A knot tightened in his stomach. He closed the laptop, the weight of his suspicion crushing him. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that Brenda was hiding something, and whatever it was big. The audit begins. Sarah Chan tapped her pen against the edge of the budget report. The rhythmic tick, a counterpoint to the gentle hum of the fluorescent lights above. It was a Tuesday, usually a quiet day for routine checks, but today, something felt off. The line item for landscaping seemed inflated, not drastically, but enough to raise a red flag. She ran the numbers again, triple-checking the invoices against the approved budget. The discrepancy remained. A difference of $3, 700. A frown etched itself onto her. Face.it could be a simple clerical error, a transposed number, a miscategorized expense. But Sarah didn't believe in coincidences. She pulled up the previous quarter's report. Then the one before that, a pattern began to emerge. Small, consistent overcharges across various maintenance categories, always just under the threshold that would trigger a more rigorous review. Someone was being very careful. The discovery gnawed at her. She wasn't one for unfounded accusations, but her gut screamed that something wasn't right. She gathered the relevant documents, a knot tightening in her stomach. This needed to be brought to the board. The HOA board meeting that evening was held in the community clubhouse, a bland room usually filled with the aroma of stale coffee and simmering resentment. Brenda Kensington, the HOA president, beamed from the head of the table, her perfectly coiffed hair reflecting the harsh overhead lighting. "Good evening, everyone," Brenda announced, her voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. "Let's get started. First on the agenda, we have the quarterly budget review." Sarah cleared her throat. "I have a few concerns regarding some discrepancies I found in the landscaping and maintenance expenses." She distributed copies of her report, the crisp paper rustling in the sudden silence. Brenda's smile faltered, a subtle flicker of unease crossing her features. "Discrepancies? I'm sure it's nothing serious, Sarah. We all make mistakes." "Perhaps," Sarah replied, her voice even. "But the inconsistencies are significant enough to warrant a closer look that I propose we conduct an internal audit." A murmur rippled through the room, an audit. The word hung in the air like a threat. Brenda recovered quickly, her smile widening into a display of civic responsibility. "Of course, Sarah. Transparency is paramount. I fully support a thorough audit. We have nothing to hide." She clapped her hands together, the sound sharp and brittle. "Let's vote." All in favor. The motion passed unanimously. Brenda, despite her forced smile, felt a cold dread creep up her spine. The audit was a disaster, a potential catastrophe. She needed to act, and fast. Back in her meticulously organized home office, Brenda's hands trembled as she accessed the HOA's financial records. The spreadsheet swam before her eyes, the numbers blurring into a chaotic mess. She took a shaky breath and began to work, her fingers flying across the keyboard. First, the landscaping invoices she scanned. In a blank invoice template, carefully forging the signature of the landscaping company's owner at a few strategically inflated numbers. A little creative accounting, and the discrepancy vanished. Then, she moved on to the plumbing expenses, fabricating receipts for phantom repairs, conjuring emergencies out of thin air. The guilt gnawed at her, a persistent ache in her chest. She thought of the community pool renovation she'd secretly diverted funds from, the new car she'd purchased with the consulting fees she'd paid herself. That IT was all spiraling out of control. She justified it to herself. She deserved it. She worked hard. She put in long hours for the HOA. She was underappreciated. But the justifications felt hollow, flimsy shields against the rising tide of anxiety as the night wore on. Brenda's office transformed into a war room, littered with crumpled receipts, half-empty coffee cups, and the faint scent of desperation. She was creating a labyrinth of lies, each new fabrication, further entangling her in a web of deceit. She closed the laptop, the screen reflecting her haggard face. She had bought herself some time, maybe, but deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. Neighborly inquiries. Mark stared at the burner phone, the faint static crackling in his ear. "Confirmed?" A voice rasped, barely audible. "Offshore account in Grand Cayman. Frequent deposits matching HOA fund withdrawal patterns. Kensington's signature on record." The air in Mark's meticulously bland apartment felt suddenly thick. Kensington, Brenda Kensington, the HOA president, the queen bee of Willow Creek Estates, the woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes, he'd suspected. Of course, that was the whole point of this assignment. But hearing it confirmed, the details laid bare, brought a surge of grim satisfaction mixed with a prickle of unease. This wasn't just some petty squabble over lawn ornaments. This was a felony that he pocketed the phone. The cool metal a grounding presence against his palm. Time for some neighborly inquiries. He walked out of his apartment and headed towards the community garden. The sun beat down on the meticulously manicured lawns, the scent of freshly cut grass mingling with the sweet fragrance of blooming roses. Brenda, as if summoned by his thoughts, was weeding a patch of petunias, her floral dress a stark contrast to the muddy earth. "Brenda," he called out, injecting a casual tone into his voice. "Beautiful flowers. You have such a green thumb." She straightened up, a forced smile gracing her lips. "Mark, just admiring the fruits of our labor, or rather, the HOA's labor. We take pride in keeping Willow Creek looking its best." "Indeed," he agreed, leaning against the fence. "It must take a lot of money to maintain all this. I was just looking over the HOA budget the other day. Seems like a significant amount flows through here." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Brenda dabbed at her forehead with a silk scarf, her movements a little too jerky. "It does," she said, her voice a touch too high-pitched. "Landscaping, maintenance, security. It all adds up that we have a fiduciary responsibility to the residents, you know. Every penny is accounted for." Mark chuckled softly, a sound that held no humor. "Of course, I was just curious. Being new here and all. Do you use a local bank? Or?" He trailed off, pretending to inspect a wilting rose that he saw her hands tighten around the gardening trowel. "We use a reputable firm," she replied, her tone suddenly clipped. "Everything is above board. Mark. I assure you. I never doubted it," he said smoothly, though his eyes didn't leave hers. "Just trying to understand how things work around here. You know, being a responsible member of the community." Brenda's smile wavered. "Well, I'm always happy to answer any questions. But I'm rather busy at the moment. I have a board meeting to prepare for." She bent down again, her back to him, her movements stiff. "Of course," Mark said, pushing off the fence. "Wouldn't want to keep you. Maybe we can chat more about it another time. Perhaps over coffee?" He watched her as he walked away. She didn't turn around, her shoulders rigid with tension. He could practically feel her paranoia radiating across the manicured lawn. He knew he'd planted the seed. Back in his apartment, Mark reviewed his notes. The conversation with Brenda had confirmed his suspicions. Her nervousness was palpable. The evasiveness cleared. It was time to turn up the heat. He needed concrete proof. A direct link between Brenda and the offshore account. He had a warrant for her financial records, but he wanted to wait. He wanted to see her sweat. He poured himself a glass of water, the silence of the apartment amplifying his thoughts. He was playing a dangerous game. A cat-and-mouse chase with a woman who had a lot to lose. Brenda Kensington was no fool. She was cunning, resourceful, and desperate, and desperation, he knew, made people do unpredictable things. Sarah's discovery. The numbers swam before Sarah's eyes. A dizzying ballet of debits and credits. Late into the night, the glow of her laptop illuminated the spare room she'd converted into a makeshift office. Empty coffee cups littered the desk, testament to the hours she'd poured into dissecting the HOA's financials. Brenda Kensington, with her perfectly coiffed hair and practiced smile, had been so adamant against an audit. Now Sarah understood why. She traced a payment labeled landscaping enhancements, a hefty sum that seemed exorbitant even for the meticulously manicured lawns of Willow Creek. Clicking through the digital ledger, she found a series of similar transactions, each vaguely worded and routed through shell companies with names like Green Thumb Solutions and Exterior Aesthetics Incorporated. A chill snaked down Sarah's spine. These weren't legitimate business expenses. They were elaborate camouflage. Using a publicly available corporate registry, she dug deeper, finding each shell company linked to a single, obscure address in the Cayman Islands. A bank account number followed an offshore account. The puzzle pieces clattered into place with sickening clarity. The next morning, Sarah marched to Brenda's sprawling colonial, the morning sun glinting off the pristine white paint. Brenda answered the door, a silk scarf artfully draped around her neck, masking the lines of worry that were starting to etch themselves around her eyes. "Sarah, darling, what a surprise," Brenda said, her voice a touch too bright. Come in. Come in. I was just about to have a mimosa. I need to talk to you about the HOA finances, Brenda," Sarah said, bypassing the offer of a drink. "I found some discrepancies." Brenda led her into a sun-drenched living room. all plush carpets and floral arrangements. Discrepancies? I assure you, everything is above board. But her hand trembled slightly as she gestured for Sarah to sit. Sarah didn't sit. She pulled out her laptop, placing it on a nearby table. These landscaping enhancements, Brenda, they're not going to landscaping, they're going to the Cayman Islands. She pointed to the screen, highlighting the bank account number. Do you care to explain this? Brenda's face paled. The practiced smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic. That's preposterous. I don't know what you're talking about. Her voice wavered. This pattern, Brenda, these transactions, they add up to a significant amount of money. Sarah pressed, her voice firm but controlled. Money that belongs to the residents of Willow Creek. It's a mistake. A clerical error. I can explain everything. Brenda's denial was shrill, unconvincing. She wrung her hands, the silk scarf slipping from her shoulders. Then explain it to the board, Sarah said, closing her laptop, because I'm presenting this to them tonight. The HOA meeting that evening was charged with an unusual tension. The usual complaints about overgrown hedges and noisy dogs were absent. All eyes were on Sarah as she stood before the assembled residents, her laptop casting a pale glow on her face. She presented her findings, methodically laying out the fraudulent transactions, the shell companies, the offshore account. A murmur rippled through the room as the reality of the situation sank in. Brenda sat rigid at the head of the table, her face a mask of forced composure, but her eyes darted nervously, betraying her fear. This is outrageous. Richard Harding, a retired lawyer known for his meticulous nature, boomed. Are you suggesting embezzlement? That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Sarah replied, her voice clear and unwavering. Several residents gasped. Others stared at Brenda in stunned disbelief. Even Agnes Plumtree, the queen of gossip, was speechless. Brenda, Richard said, turning to the HOA president, his voice dangerously low. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Brenda opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. This is all a misunderstanding, she stammered. I can explain. But no one was listening. The carefully constructed facade of Willow Creek had cracked, revealing the rot beneath. The air crackled with anger and betrayal. Sarah had unearthed a secret and in doing so, had irrevocably changed the landscape of their quiet suburban community, the block party bust. Miller tapped his earpiece, Ramirez's voice a digitized buzz in his ear. Position secure. Kensington's at the dunking booth. Looks like she's sucking on a sour ball. A low chuckle vibrated in Miller's chest. Roger that, Ramirez, standing by. He scanned Maple Street. A vibrant tableau of summer unfolded before him, the sway of multicolored balloons, the joyous shrieks of children navigating a goofy obstacle course. The mingled sense of sizzling barbecue and sunblock hanging heavy in the evening air. A classic neighborhood block party, typically orchestrated by Brenda Kensington with an iron will thinly veiled by a plastic smile. Tonight, that smile seemed brittle, almost manic. He nodded subtly to Davies, who eased the nondescript van. Closer to the park's perimeter, Miller inhaled deeply. He loathed these public takedowns, the unavoidable spectacle, but Kensington had dodged every attempt at a quiet interview. The warrant was airtight, the evidence irrefutable. Time to act. Across the grassy expanse, Brenda Kensington was unraveling. Sarah Chin, her perennial thorn in her side since uncovering the budget irregularities, approached bearing a loaded plate, potato salad. Brenda's stomach churned. Sarah, she managed, her voice taut, must you? I explicitly requested no mayo-based potato salad. I end this heat, it's precarious. Sarah arched a brow unperturbed. It's Mrs. Henderson's, Brenda. The gold standard. Loosen up, it's a block party. Speaking of which, about that audit. Brenda's smile became a rictus. The audit is under advisement, Sarah. Such things require due diligence, unlike your unsolicited input. She waved a dismissive hand, then noticed Mark, the new neighbor, leaning against an oak, observing the dunking booth with quiet amusement. He was always so reserved, so keenly observant. A dart of suspicion pierced her. Too observant. Mark. She called, her tone sharper than intended. He straightened and approached, a polite smile playing on his lips. Brenda, enjoying the festivities. Are you? She countered, her gaze intense. You seem rather disengaged for a recent arrival. Mark offered a soft laugh, a sound that scraped against her frayed nerves. Just absorbing the local color, quite a performance. A performance? Brenda's voice hitched up an octave. Is that what you see this as? A mere performance? This is our community, Mark. Our painstakingly built, everything. Her voice caught. She felt the weight of gazes upon her, the subtle hush of conversations as her agitation became apparent. Miller recognized his cue. He signaled. Simultaneously, Davies piloted the van into the park. Ramirez and Johnson materialized from the throng, and Miller began his advance toward Brenda, his strides measured and unwavering. Brenda, sensing the atmosphere shift, whirled around, her eyes wide with dawning alarm. "What is happening? What's going on?" She clutched Mark's arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "Mark, tell me, you know something, don't you?" Mark gently peeled her fingers away. "Brenda," he said, his voice a soothing murmur, "I believe it's time for a conversation." He reached inside his jacket and produced a badge, its golden sheen reflecting the dying sunlight. "Brenda Kensington, you're under arrest for embezzlement and fraud." Color leached from Brenda's face. "What? This is absurd. This is persecution. I'm the HOA president. I'm a volunteer. This is a misunderstanding." A hush fell over the crowd, the celebratory mood dissolving like smoke. All eyes fixed on Brenda, on Mark, on Agent Miller, who had reached them and was now reciting her rights. "You have the right to remain silent." Miller's words sliced through the stunned silence. Brenda's meticulously crafted facade shattered. She saw Sarah, whose expression was a complex blend of shock and satisfaction. She saw her neighbors, their faces mirroring a range of reactions from disbelief to condemnation, and then she looked at Mark, the quiet, unassuming neighbor who had just detonated her life. "Mark," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. You're FBI?" Mark, no. Agent Miller simply nodded, his expression inscrutable. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the sudden stillness. The block party was officially over. Aftershocks in Harmony Glades. The news hit Harmony Glades like a rogue hailstorm, leaving a trail of shattered trust and whispered accusations. Brenda Kensington, their impeccably coiffed, perpetually smiling HOA president, a criminal, embezzling funds. It was absurd, impossible. Yet plastered across the local news website with unflattering mugshots and glaring headlines. Harmony Glades HOA president arrested on multiple felony charges. Front yards transformed into impromptu town halls. Mrs. Gable, watering her petunias, nearly fainted when Mr. Henderson relayed the details, sputtering through his dentures about how Brenda always seemed a bit too fond of the community pool renovations. Across the street, the Millers argued in their driveway, their voices rising above the drone of lawnmowers. Had Brenda really taken money from the holiday decorations fund? Little Timmy would be heartbroken. Sarah Chin felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. The budget discrepancies she'd unearthed, initially dismissed as simple accounting errors, were now glaring evidence of Brenda's elaborate scheme. The proposed audit, which Brenda had so vehemently opposed, would have exposed everything months ago. Now, the air hung thick with the stench of betrayal, a far cry from the sweet scent of freshly cut grass she usually associated with Harmony Glades. She sat on her porch swing, sipping iced tea. The rhythmic creak a counterpoint to the frantic energy swirling around her. It wasn't just the money, although the amount was staggering, enough to fund a small college education. It was the violation of trust. The manipulation of neighbors who had genuinely believed in Brenda's leadership. She thought of the countless hours she'd spent volunteering for the community garden, all while Brenda was lining her pockets. Later that week, Brenda's trial began. The courtroom was packed, a motley collection of Harmony Glades residents, local reporters, and curious onlookers. Brenda, looking pale and gaunt, sat rigidly beside her lawyer, a high-powered attorney who seemed perpetually irritated. Her signature power suit was replaced with a drab, ill-fitting pantsuit, and her perfectly styled hair seemed to have lost its bounce. The prosecution painted a damning picture of Brenda's greed. They presented irrefutable evidence, falsified invoices, offshore bank accounts, and lavish personal expenses funded by HOA dues. A witness, a former accountant hired by Brenda, testified under oath about being pressured to manipulate financial records. The details were sickening. Brenda had siphoned funds intended for everything from playground repairs to senior center activities. The sheer scope of her deception was breathtaking. Sarah watched Brenda during the proceedings. There was no remorse in her eyes, only a flickering, desperate denial. At one point, Brenda turned her head, catching Sarah's gaze. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Sarah saw not the confident, commanding woman she had known as HOA president, but a frightened, cornered animal. The prosecutor held up an exhibit, a statement from an offshore bank account, showing a transfer of $50,000 earmarked for a new roof on the community center, now used for Brenda's luxury yacht. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The yacht, Sarah remembered, had been the subject of many admiring comments at the last Harmony Glades picnic. Irony dripped like acid. The Trial was far from over, but the atmosphere in Harmony Glades had already shifted. The initial disbelief had given way to anger, then to a quiet, simmering resolve. They had been betrayed, but they would not be broken. The aftershocks of Brenda's actions would reverberate for years to come, but perhaps in the wreckage of shattered trust, a stronger, more honest community could be rebuilt. The process, however, would be painful. A new beginning. Brenda Kensington was a husk of her former self. The crimson power suits, symbols of her reign, were gone, replaced by an ill-fitting, drab jumpsuit that drowned her diminished figure. Even her signature, helmet-like coiffure of blonde hair appeared lackluster. Robbed of its usual sheen, throughout the judge's monotonous pronouncements, Brenda's gaze flickered nervously around the room, settling momentarily on Sarah Chan in the gallery. Sarah offered no solace, only a steady, unwavering look, a gaze laced with both triumph and profound melancholy. The judge's gavel fell, punctuating the air. 5 years restitution to the Harmony Glades Homeowners Association in the amount of. The sum reverberated through the hushed courtroom. A final, damning decree. Brenda recoiled. It wasn't the prison sentence that shattered her composure, but the monetary penalty. She had always envisioned absconding with the funds, luxuriating somewhere distant, starting anew with pilfered gains. A strangled sound escaped her throat, and for the first time since the probe began, a spark of genuine comprehension ignited within her eyes. Not just understanding of the legal ramifications, but a stark realization of the profound, self-inflicted wound. The meticulously crafted veneer of superiority crumbled, revealing the vulnerable core beneath as the bailiffs escorted her away. She didn't dare look back. Harmony Glades commenced its long journey to recovery. Under Sarah's judicious leadership, the HOA board instituted rigorous financial protocols. Dual authorization became mandatory for all significant transactions. Monthly financial statements were published online for homeowner review. Transparency became the watchword, superseding the former, comfortable negligence. The recovered capital, just over half of Brenda's ill-gotten gains, was earmarked for community enhancements, a revamped playground, upgrades to the walking paths, amenities for all to enjoy. The monthly HOA meetings, once sparsely populated and dominated by Brenda's pronouncements, transformed into vibrant, sometimes even heated, forums for discussion. Residents felt empowered to express their opinions, challenge preconceptions, and engage in the management of their community. Progress wasn't always seamless. Long-held grievances resurfaced and disagreements flared. Yet, a nascent spirit of cooperation emerged, a willingness to listen, to negotiate, to collaborate for the collective good. Agent Miller, his mission in Harmony Glades concluded, packed his belongings. He touched the brim of his hat to Mrs. Rodriguez as he stowed his luggage. The aroma of her empanadas still clinging to the air. He wouldn't miss the meticulously sculpted lawns and rigidly symmetrical rose bushes, but he would miss the burgeoning sense of community he had inadvertently fostered. He was already contemplating his next assignment. Another tranquil suburb concealing a secret, another neighborhood needing a dose of revelation. Weeks dissolved into months. The scars of Brenda's perfidy persisted, a constant reminder of the precariousness of trust. Yet, something else was taking root, a revitalized sense of connection, a keener awareness of the importance of unity. Block parties blossomed, potlucks became commonplace. Individuals who had once been strangers, separated by manicured lawns and unspoken social stratifications, began to bond, to share their lives, to support one another. One evening, Sarah strolled through the neighborhood, the atmosphere saturated with the fragrance of honeysuckle and freshly mown grass. The joyous sounds of children resonated from the reimagined playground. Neighbors conversed on their porches, their voices blending with the chorus of crickets. The sun descended below the horizon, painting the heavens in shades of vermilion and amethyst. Harmony Glades remained picturesque, impeccably maintained. But it was more than mere beauty now. It possessed resilience. It had become self-aware. It was a community tempered by betrayal, emerging stronger, wiser, and far more interconnected. The perfectly sculpted lawns seemed less significant now, less indicators of prestige, and more symbols of a shared space, a tribute to their joint effort to reconstruct what had been shattered at a renaissance, sprouting from the ruins of the past.